Hey friends, I'm here today talking to you about the survey results of my Lady 8 Enneagram survey. I'm super excited about this. Thank you so much to those of you who participated in that survey. There's just no way I could talk about this content in the detail that I can today because without responses from those of you guys who participated, especially the written responses, those of you who took time to write. I so appreciate that. We had about 260 participants, so that was huge. That's awesome, especially for a statistically low population type like 8. That was a huge turnout, which is awesome. Today I am going to be speaking from some notes. Normally I don't do that, but this topic and the information I have from the survey is just so much rich information, so I don't want to miss anything. This will be part 1 of 2 parts to the survey results and discussing them because there was just so much, and unfortunately just the period of life that I'm in, I just don't have the time right now to put together one long video. So there are so many subjects here that we need to talk about. First I'm going to talk about why misidentification matters. So one of the topics we're going to be talking about today because of this survey is misidentification, because one of the main takeaways I feel like I've drawn from the results is that a good amount of people who took it, I think, may be misidentified. This is not uncommon, so please don't feel like that's some sort of extreme statement. It's not a witch hunt, but I want to talk about why misidentification matters so that you understand why I'm even addressing that point. I know a lot of teachers, a lot of people who talk about the Enneagram on Instagram or on YouTube or on the otherwise internet don't really address misidentification, and the reason I do is twofold. One is for your own health, your own emotional health, your own emotional and spiritual potential. The Enneagram does not work to your benefit unless you are correctly identified. That's just how it is. I mean, I've talked to so many people who were in the wrong type conclusion for years and just could not understand like why they weren't finding the tool useful. And then eventually they came to a conclusion that they were in the wrong type identification, and that's why it wasn't working for them. So that's like the main point. But number 2, I'm a stats girl. Like, I love statistics, I love polling, I love this kind of stuff we're talking about today, where you really get into the meat and you get to see like statistical dispersion in the population and like demographics. And misidentification kills study. It kills the ability to create study on the Enneagram and to find out the finer detail of the people who do identify as a certain type group. If we're misidentified, it just completely nullifies the validity of any findings or results. I first came across this realization when I did my very first Enneagram project, if you will, which was a photo interview project. It's still on my Enneagram Girl blog if you want to see it. But all I had to find were one man and one woman of each core type, like in real life in the area I was living in at the time, which was the northwest suburbs of Chicago. And honestly, finding correctly identified people was sometimes hard. Certain more plentiful Enneagram types like 6 and 9 were a little bit easier to find, especially because at the time I was very involved in a large church where people knew what the Enneagram was. But other types, I'm not kidding you, I had to sit across at coffee shops, across table after table with people, kind of very gently just asking questions and trying to discern whether they were correctly identified, and many of them weren't. And that was no offense to those people, but I couldn't put my project in jeopardy for using a participant that I didn't feel was correctly identified. So as a stats study-based girl, this stuff really matters to me. And it's one of the reasons actually I put this survey out. I said a little bit in the blurb on the survey that I had seen in the last 6 months particularly, but 6 months to maybe like a year and a half, the female 8 stats just like skyrocket on surveys. And in just comments on Enneagram material. And I wanted to know why. I wanted to know, like, what is it? For so long, these stats, male and female, have been very low for 8. 4, 5, and 8 are the least commonly statistical Enneagram types. And actually, when you look at the psychology and sociology of how those personality traits fit into the culture, that makes sense. I mean, it makes sense for those traits to be lower from a cultural standpoint, from a sociological standpoint. The number of people reporting to be female 8s was really skyrocketing, and I started like digging a little bit and like reading comments and like looking a little bit closer at like who's making these comments, and kind of starting to have this feeling of like, I think some of these people are misidentified. And so when I gave this survey, you know, those of you who took it, you know, the questions I asked were like very basic. They were very open-ended. They were very, some of them were too open-ended. I just have to disclaim, the one question about sadism, those of you who took the test, was not about sex. It was not about sex at all. So, but that reveals to me that those of you who thought it was, maybe haven't like read into the 8 material as much as you think you have. Because those of us who have know that sadism, from an emotional place, from a social place, for an 8 is a temptation and is a topic with an 8. It's the desire to, as some of you said in your written responses, that 8s sometimes like to see people squirm, or like to see people receive their just desserts, and like to reign over that and see people get what they think they deserve. So that's what sadism was, what I meant when I said sadism in that question. But so for those of you who responded, there are so many responses that fall into several categories of misidentification. And I have to say, I'm not here to draw conclusions on any individuals or anything to that detailed extent, but I am here to pose to you some prompts. Those of you who took the survey, those of you who do identify as an 8, to give you some material to vet yourself and to know that if I truly want to be correctly identified, have I considered these things? So there, in these camps, there are several big ones. One of them is Enneagram 1. Some of you even said in the question that said, what did you first identify as, or have you always identified as an 8? Some of you even said that you once identified as 1s. And that does not mean you are a 1, but some of you, I think the written responses that were given, even some of the responses about anger, there's a very fine line there. I once made a video, a misidentification video between 8 and 1, and actually, okay, now that I've rambled a good deal about some of that overarching material and kind of why we're talking about this stuff, I want to get into some specific points. So, I want to talk about another Achilles heel to this whole process, and that is instinctual variation. So a lot of you guys said things in your responses or chose answers that really made me realize this, that I don't think people, even though one of the questions was, what is your instinct, your first instinct, I think that a lot of times people identify as either Enneagram 8 or Enneagram 4 when they are SX first. So sometimes I like to think of it as certain Enneagram core types feel very like one of the instincts. So for instance, 6 and 9 feel very SP, if you will. Like, not all 6s and 9s are SP, but they feel that way. So it's easy for someone who's an SP first individual to identify as one of those types because they feel very SP. 4 and 8 feel very SX. And when I say that, I mean there's an intensity and a passion, and a directness, an authenticity that tends to be unfiltered in both 4 and 8 that people who are SX first tend to identify with on the surface. And when they first look at it, they're like, oh yeah, like those traits, but what that really is SX. So I want to use an example. I have an SX first Enneagram 1 friend who I know wouldn't mind me sharing her story, and when she first started investigating the Enneagram, she identified as 1 pretty quickly. And then because of who she is and wanting to be correct in her identification, she really started filtering through the types, and she came to 8, and she came to me and was like, like, am I an 8? Like, could I be an 8? Like, I kind of think I might be an 8. And we sat with the material, we talked through it, and kind of asked questions. And, you know, I mean, I considered too, like, is she an 8? And this was really in the midst of like some of my early instinctual variation studies. So it was very interesting because she knew already that she was SX first, but she hadn't really dug into what that means. And those of you who follow my work at all, I use the Claudio Naranjo instinctual descriptions, which honestly I think are far and away the best. All the infographics for my instinct material on the Enneagram Girl blog are all based on his work. Like, those are his words. And the SX first one, when you look at it, is a much more intense and a much more visceral one. So when we look at SX1, the core of, for one, obviously is anger. And the SX first one, though, relates that to intimacy and likes to take hold of individuals and make them what they want them to be. And those of you watching, or those of you who took the survey, some of you wrote things like that. Some of you wrote things like, well, I really like to, I wish I had a direct quote, but it was things like, I really like to guide people and help them become who they should be. And some of that, you know, I can't be conclusive. I can't say, oh, that's a 1. But some of that to me says, like, wait, like, there's a bell there. Like, let's look at this. Let's step back. So some of you need to step back and look at Enneagram 1 a little bit closer, but under the lens of SX. I think sometimes we really just throw those instincts away when honestly they're some of the most important material. Another example is I myself am an SX first 4, and a lot of SX first 4s tend to mistakenly identify with 8. And that is because, as Naranjo says in his instinctual variant description of SX4, that 4s are shameful, but the SX4 is called the shameless 4, that turns around when it feels shameful and says, are you hurting me? I'm gonna, or do I hurt? I'm gonna make you hurt with me. And that is like this very, it's like masochism turns into sadism. So, and of course, that's not pretty. And that is another point for this survey, which is that a lot of you really struggled to identify with some of the negative traits of 8. There were a lot of responses. I'd say, I think it was almost 50%. It was like 49 point something percent of people very directly responded to the sadism question of being like, no, absolutely not, nope, not me, no. And that's like a little bit hard to process when we're talking about 8, because that would be like a 7 being asked about like gluttony or about extremism and being like, no, 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 that's not me. And again, like coming back to what I've said in previous videos, the Enneagram is about sin patterns. It's about our dark side. And yes, like, do we have potential as people, and do we use this tool to move towards our potential? Yes. But there were a good amount of answers that I was happy to see. People saying, yeah, honestly, like, it scares me a little bit. Like, sometimes, if I'm honest, like, how much I do like to see people get their just desserts, and how much I like can cause people pain when I think it's just. And even though that sense of justice might not be like moral. So those are the kinds of answers that I would expect from a core 8. And you know, that is one of the biggest differences when we look at 1 versus 8, is that 1 is ruled by morality. 1 pursues justice. One of the other names for the reformer 1 is the crusader. 1s are ruled by justice pursuit and but it's like a morality based pursuit of justice. 8, on the other hand, does not pursue morality, really. I mean, in health, they can reach that and see the benefit of morality, but one of my participants, I want to use a quote here because actually some of these wrote down because they were so good. One of my participants, which I'll call participant number 169, said, quote, "Doing what I want, when I want, because I want to. Having power over myself regardless of the situation, defending the weak, reading the room." Now, some of those later components of what she said are another conversation, but what she's saying here is that her pursuit of justice is not necessarily moral justice. When we look at 8, it's a very personal justice. It's based on what that individual sees as just. And a lot of times this can manifest in like vigilante justice and in taking great measures to pursue what they see as justice, even though it's not been agreed upon by anyone other than themselves, and definitely not by the larger culture like morality would be. So on the flip side, 1s sometimes are called 8s in chains because they're chained by morality, and there's that check and balance there of like, this is just because it's moral. 8, on the other hand, doesn't pursue that. That's why we see 8 a little bit more as a cowboy and a little bit more as reckless or chaotic, because they determine their own morality and their own justice. So if I talk to 5 different 8s, they could all have a different perception of what justice is. And that is why 8 does fall into that same category of individualism. The other category in this response pool that I feel like really showed up hard was 3. Enneagram 3 and kind of this misidentification. I just did a video on this, which might be helpful for some of you who might be more on that side of things. So there were a lot of you that reported sort of like a high attention to personal appearance. There were a lot of you that reported a high attention to achievement and success. And some of you even, there was even one quote that basically said, I will wear myself out and endanger my own health in order to win, or in order to achieve success. And that is 3. That is 3. Most 8s that I've encountered, and the 8 material is prone to competition, but only competition in regards to, again, that notion of personal justice, or a personal vendetta of sorts, or something. Some of you mentioned like your people, like the people in an 8's life that they're willing to go to bat for. Like that would be worth that kind of effort. But in regards to just success and achievement, most 8s do not have that sort of value seeking that a 3 would. A 3 in order to wear themselves out for it. To fall on their face in order to achieve success. An 8 generally, honestly, doesn't need to exude even that much effort in order to do it. It's much more of an individualistic pursuit. So one more thought on the 1 front that we were talking about. This is something that came up over and over in the written responses, and that is sort of this concept of control. A lot of you talked about control and kind of like needing it or wanting it, desiring to have control, but I think that this one person said, we'll call her participant 162, said, quote, I don't need to be in control, but I do not want to be controlled. I think that is really the main distinction between 1 and 8. So 1s and their desire for control, which we have to remember they do have, really is more about ensuring correctness and order and justice happens. A lot of you mentioned justice. And again, that's justice that's a moral justice. It's a, you know, people often cite like Joan of Arc. It's, but I've seen 1s do this in a way that really attempts to control others and control the course of life and control events going on. 1s are the ones that in a corporate workspace may take on the work of others in order to ensure that it is right and say, you are not competent enough to do this. I will do this. And especially in SX1, will do that in a very dominating way. But again, we have to go back to the motive and the why. So 1s are doing this to pursue that sense of correctness and order and good. Is this good? I want it to be good. I want it to be right. And they only have one perception of what that is. 8, on the other hand, really only cares for freedom and autonomy and the ability to go their own way. There were a couple other participants too who spoke to this and saying, you know, like, I don't Here's one. Okay. Lady participant number 165 said, there's a lot of 160s in here. Sorry for that, guys, but it's apparently the section I was browsing at the time. But this woman said, the desire to not be controlled. I think 8s get a reputation for wanting to take control, but I find that it's really a reaction to someone else's attempt to control me when I become assertive or aggressive. So that's a huge difference between a 1 and an 8, in that 1s are very offensive when it comes to control. They want to control the flow of events in life and people and make sure things are good. And this changes with instincts. I mean, if you go and look at those instinct graphics on the Enneagram Girl blog, you know, the social one is much more like swan-like, in that they're like, follow me as I do right. But the SX one is not like that. They will lean into people and say, this is wrong, we will fix it. And that is a very different energy that I think some people associate with 8, when really that's just SX, as we were talking about. The other thing that did show up a little bit, but to a lesser degree than 1 or 3, is a little bit of 6. I think sometimes we forget what button pushers 6s are, and sometimes 6s, especially honestly, which is not what we're talking about today, male 6s tend to misidentify as 8s a lot. I don't see that as much with women, but still sometimes. And I think it's those counterphobic 6s that like to embrace what they're afraid of by knocking it out, that's kind of have too much bravado to be an 8. I would say that most 8s don't have a lot of bravado. It's kind of like when people compare like a Chihuahua and a German Shepherd, and it's kind of like the German Shepherd's like laying down over there, like self-assured and knowing what it's capable of. The Chihuahua's over here like, and I've owned both breeds of dog, by the way, but the Chihuahua's over here like being very aggressive and barking a lot, and like the Chihuahua I had would actually bleed people, like he would bite people. And so that's like a huge difference, in that both can cause damage, but like both are capable, but the one is self-assured and doesn't have bravado, and so that's more the 8. And the 6 has a lot more bravado, a lot more chip on the shoulder, and sort of, I need to prove myself. So there's a little bit of that also. So I did make a list too. At one point I almost launched a series on misidentification and called it, you might not be a blank if you blank. So like, you might not be an 8 if you, and one that I know I'm going to get pushback for, which is totally okay, is you might not be an 8 if you spend a lot of time on your appearance. I know we are women. And to some extent, it's actually probably healthy for 8s to spend a little time on their appearance. Like when they're more health focused, they can allow that and know that like, it's okay to be a little soft. That comes into our vulnerability piece, which I'm going to talk about next. So for the sake of summary, the things that 8 is not. 8 is not a moral crusader. That's 1. 8 is not a reformer of others. That's 1. 8 is not a competitive achiever or a task-oriented yes person. That would be 3. I would actually categorize 8 as a no person. That's generally, as that earlier survey participant said, that's really more pushing back with no when people are encroaching on them, rather than saying yes to everything in the world in order to like dominate, which is more what a 3 does in the name of achievement. 8 is also not a skeptical button pusher. That's more of a 6. 8 does push buttons, but again, really only when they are feeling antagonized, they'll push buttons back. There's a really interesting authority nuance there between 6 and 8, but you know, I mean, authority was mentioned some of the time in the survey results. Some of the people mentioned like how terrifying it is to live under authority. And I would say that could be 6 or 8, but the question is that view of authority, does that have a dichotomy like 6 does, which is that they like authority figures that have earned their loyalty, but they're very skeptical of authority figures that are new or that are unproven. 8, on the other hand, kind of ignores authority unless that authority is like rubbing them the wrong way, or not pursuing the interests that they would like to be pursuing. It's kind of like a if it ain't broke, don't fix it type of thing, I think, for 8. And then, as I was starting to say in regards to that appearance 3 one, some of the other things that I would put in the you might not be an 8 if camp are you care more about moral justice than personal, potentially vigilante justice. So we talked about that a little bit earlier. You manipulate rather than dominate. So those things are really different. That's a difference between 3 and 8. 3s manipulate a situation in order to get what they want. But they don't want to look necessarily like a jerk on the outside. 8s, on the other hand, tend to dominate before they think when those buttons are pushed and they're reacting back towards them. And really, I don't think could manipulate if they wanted to. And then this last one is, you might not be an 8 if you don't want power or you don't try to control other people. So a lot of the response I got to that sadism question, which I understand is like maybe off-putting to some of you guys, me just using the word sadism, but not really wanting control over other people or not really having that tendency towards control. And I would say then you're probably not an 8. I mean, I'm just going to say that. I mean, even people I know, some of you cited having a 9 wing, that might soften things, but the truth is, I even know 9s with 8 wings that are very obviously trying to control people. So, and of course, I'm not talking about like trying to like dominate like a company or trying to, you know, I'm not talking about like grandiose things, but throwing their weight around, and that can be either verbally or silently or socially in order to have things the way that they want them and push back against people wanting things a different way. So when we talk about controlling tendencies, if you're somebody who's identifying as an 8, you should have controlling tendencies. That's like a trademark quality. That would be like a 4 not being a feelsy person, or it would be like a 7 not being a variety-seeking person. So it's another, I think, inconvenient thing about the Enneagram for some people, which I need to make a totally other video on, but it's that the Enneagram acknowledges intrinsic truth. These Enneagram types are not like customizable, if you will. I mean, there are shades of 8. There are 8s with 7 wings, 8s with 9 wings, social 8s, sexual 8s, self-pres 8s. But there is a limit to that, and there is a scope of criteria that one must fall under to identify as an 8. Anyway, that brings us to our end of part 1, guys. I will touch on part 2 next time, which is actual stats, which is graphs and bar charts and all that stuff. So if you're looking for that, tune in next time.